afternoon, and welcome to the Korea-Europe Peace Forum. Today's forum is organized by the Sejong Institute and the Free University of Berlin, and sponsored by Gyeonggi Province and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. In today's sessions, we will hear from renowned European and Korean policymakers and scholars who will share their insights on peace and security in Europe and Korea. Before we get started, please allow me to make a few brief announcements. First, today's session will be conducted in English, but you can listen to the Korean interpretation using the receiver at your seat. Second, we would like to ask everyone to please mute your phones during today's presentation and discussion session. Finally, we are filming today's session, so please be mindful of the camera at the back of the room and try to avoid walking or standing in front of the camera. Today's first session will begin with opening remarks by Sang-hyun Lee, President of the Sejong Institute, followed by a keynote address by Angela Kane, Vice President of the International Institute for Peace in Vienna and former UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. With that, let's begin the session, and please join me in welcoming the President of the Sejong Institute, Sang-hyun Lee.
Well, on behalf of the Sejong Institute, I would like to welcome all of you to this wonderful panel. Well, initially, this panel was intended to be a separate forum between Europe and Korea, but somehow we participated in the DMZ forum this year as Sejong is joining this forum, organizing international sessions on this forum. And already in the morning session, we all heard that what meaning the DMZ has for peace and prosperity, and also green development. And on the extension of that, in this session, we will try to learn Europe's lesson from how Europe could successfully transform Cold War system into a peace system. And I think this is quite timely that because of the uncertain global situation. And also we see that recently peace of the Korean Peninsula is also quite in trouble because inter-Korean relations has been in bad shape. And through today and tomorrow's session, I indeed hope that we can share our wisdom and experience to make some sustainable peace on the Korean Peninsula. Once again, I would like to welcome all of you to this meaningful and excellent panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Sang-hyun Lee, for your opening remarks. Please join me in welcoming Angela Kane.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here and wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me to this 2020 DMZ Forum. And I'm really delighted to be here, and I've listened with great interest to the sessions that were held this morning, and particularly to the opening keynote session. It was particularly powerful for me, and I wanted to start with a personal observation. I am from Germany, and that's a country that has lived for decades with the DMZ before the country was reunited 30 years ago. And as you know, the DMZ in Germany divided not only East Germany and West Germany, but it also was cut straight through the capital of Berlin. And so that was constant reminders of the DMZ's very jarring presence. Now, these days, if you've visited, you can't even see where the DMZ was. And the young generation really has no interest at all in knowing about it or knowing where it was or where it would run. And the discussion between the governor and Professor Choi really resonated with me, as they were observing that one should always talk about not the overall goal of peace, but really break it down on implementing projects that would benefit the environment. They talked about cooperation in the soft issues like sports or music, biodiversity, or other projects in that manner, which I thought was very, very powerful. I also wanted to mention that when I worked in the United Nations, I served in a peacekeeping mission in Ethiopia and Eritrea. And we were there, our task was to delimitate the boundary between the two countries. And that boundary was 1,000 kilometers long. And the two countries were divided by a DMZ that was 25 kilometers in width. And all of it, of this 25 kilometers, was inside the country of Eritrea, which is not a very large country. And that was a problem, because basically it included a very fertile area in a very arid country, and that had always been traditionally used by both sides of the farmers living on either side to graze their cattle. And that was before the Eritrean independence, and that became a flashpoint. But it also became a way of interacting and discussing between the two sides. So one has to look at what could be positive effects from a situation that was also confrontational. And I thought that that was really very interesting. So clearly, DMZs were in my past in the years. But let me now speak about the topic that you've asked me to address, and that is basically the Ukraine war, European peace, and implications for the Korean Peninsula. And as we know, the third millennium is really reshaping the world. The global order has undergone tremendous shifts. The 1990s saw the dissolution of the Soviet Empire. We saw the war in the states of the former Yugoslavia, but we also saw the expansion of the European Union and the adoption of a common currency, all accompanied by a very hopeful sense of life becoming better and people becoming more prosperous. The UN's Millennium Goals, and we've already heard about them in a previous session, were replaced in 2015 by the Sustainable Development Goals. That was a blueprint to enhance the quality of life worldwide, and they are to be attained, or were to be attained, I should say, by the year 2030, which we heard about in the earlier session. China made huge strides in the economy, became a world power on par with the United States, and America was no longer the single most powerful player in exerting its unipolar influence and policies around the globe. Now, what happened since then? First, Brexit upended our sense of complacency in Europe. Then, our sense of security was profoundly shattered with the outbreak of COVID-19, which showed that we were woefully unprepared to respond to pandemics, even though we had witnessed pandemics in the past. And I'm just mentioning Ebola, H1N1, SARS. With COVID-19, what was the effect until now? Over 6 million people lost their lives globally, and more than 530 million were infected. 2.5 years after the outbreak was first declared, the disease is still with us. More bad news followed. Geopolitical tensions increased during the pandemic, and climate change became a major disruptor. In February this year, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine after having annexed Crimea in 2014. The Crimea invasion and takeover violated the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, and that was an arrangement that Russia had signed together with the US and the UK after Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal, and it respected the signatories, meaning Ukraine's, independence and sovereignty in its existing borders. So that was a very clear violation of the Budapest Memorandum. Now, the Russian invasion and the war in Ukraine that we have seen, which broke out in February, has now been raging for 7 months. It's a war in Europe that has profoundly impacted the European continent, but also the world. So what are the consequences for Europe, but what are the consequences also for international relations? Let me start with the worst-case scenario, and that's the crisis escalating possibly into nuclear warfare. There are two scenarios. The first focused on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which supplied 30% of the Ukraine's electricity prior to Russia's invasion. Russian forces have control of the nuclear power plant since March, while Ukrainian technicians continue to operate the facility, but shelling around the site in recent weeks, for which both Russia and Ukraine blame each other, have raised concerns about a possible nuclear catastrophe. The fears further increased following a visit from the inspectors of the International Atomic Energy Organization, which confirmed that the plant's physical integrity had been, as they called it, violated several times. The UN Security Council had briefings on the issue, but without being able to take concrete action due to Russia's presence and veto threat. The second scenario focuses on the possible use of a nuclear weapon. While the 5 nuclear weapon states in the Non-Proliferation Treaty only in January this year reaffirmed the Reagan-Gorbachev statement of 1985 that a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought, the taboo against a nuclear detonation appears to be losing salience. The Russian invasion has upended what was left of 60 years of bilateral US, Soviet, Russian arms control and proliferation agreements, and Putin has recently made statements that he would be prepared to use a nuclear weapon, and I quote, in the event of a threat to Russia's sovereignty, unquote. The last time of such danger was the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. But we must remember that at that time, there were only 2 players involved. That was the Soviet Union and the United States. The crisis today involves multiple players, Europe, but also NATO, whose recently adopted strategic concept leaves no ambiguity about the continued role of nuclear weapons. It is seen as the ultimate guarantor of NATO security, though its use is described as, quote, extremely remote, unquote. I would not characterize the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a global war. It is a regional war. It's a war that can drag on for an awfully long time, but according to Russian analyst Alexei Abatov, and I quote him, the Ukrainian problem will be peacefully resolved no matter how difficult and remote this outcome seems now, unquote. It is, however, remarkable that pitting the US and NATO against Russia has not produced a larger military crisis and an escalation. In fact, I believe that the threat of a nuclear detonation will continue to tamp down escalation between the US/NATO and Russia, despite some ominous warnings about possible nuclear weapons use, as mentioned by Putin above. The war in Ukraine is, in my opinion, finally a test of political will. Each side wants a win, and the battles could last for a long, long time. How resilient is Europe with regard to energy dependence? How resistant is Russia against sanctions? How resistant is Russia against political isolation from the West? Against a brain drain of younger people used to free travel to the West? The world as we know it really no longer exists. This is a painful realization, but we would deceive ourselves if we did not admit it and make the needed adjustments, lower our expectations, scale down, possibly make sacrifices in our daily lives. We can no longer pretend that this crisis will pass soon, as so many others have in recent decades. We're dealing now with a much more complex political environment, geopolitical environment, I should say. The US and China were superpowers in a bipolar world before the Russian war broke out, and I would wager that they will remain in those positions after the war ends. Russia was a strong middle power before the invasion of Ukraine, with an overrated military, but still using its veto power in the Security Council to great political effect, projecting the message that Russia counts on the world stage, no matter what. Russia will, however, emerge from this war greatly diminished. We've already seen the brain drain from Russia, and sanctions will further damage the economy and erode trust in the government. Oil money can only go so far, though it is undisputed that Russia has made major financial gains from its energy resources. Russia, which I believe always considered itself part of Europe and its history, is moving very fast to align itself away from the West and towards China. President Putin attended the Beijing Olympics only days before the invasion into Ukraine, and both he and Chairman Xi Jinping declared their opposition to NATO expansion and reaffirmed that the island of Taiwan is part of China. They also jointly declared that, and I quote, "some forces representing a minority on the world stage continue to advocate unilateral approaches to resolving international problems and resort to military policy," unquote. And that is clearly a stab at the US and its allies, whom they also accused of, quote, "interference in the internal affairs," unquote, of other states. And the Russia-China alliance is, according to former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, highly significant. It puts at risk China's wider relationship with the Europeans, he observed, but she believes he is powerful enough, or is now powerful enough, and has sufficient economic leverage with Europe to get away with it. It also signifies, he said, that China now sees itself as a global, not just a regional, security actor. It's clear that Russia, as a junior partner, further strengthens China's role and influence globally, balancing the US on confirming the current US-China bipolarity. The China-Russia economic and diplomatic cooperation expanded to the military field nearly 10 years ago already, fueled at that time by the standoff in the Security Council over Syria. The two countries have held joint war games. They have included naval drills and patrols by long-range bombers over the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea. In August 2021, a year ago, Russian troops for the first time deployed to Chinese territory for joint maneuvers. And last month, the military exercises took place in Russia's Far East, though with dramatically fewer Russian troops, meaning 50,000 versus 300,000 in 2018. But still, pushing through with the military drills despite Russia's ongoing invasion into Ukraine and China's stepped-up war games around Taiwan, the two countries clearly want to demonstrate that they are doing business as usual under the, quote, "friendship without limits" agreement that was signed by Putin and Xi in Beijing in February. Now, what advantage would China derive or draw from these developments? Risk conflict with the United States over Taiwan, now that US and NATO is fully engaged with supporting Ukraine's war effort, flex its muscles even more in the South China Sea. Considerations not only revolve around geopolitics, because we must also take into account other factors in China, such as food insecurity, an aging population, her need to import natural resources, especially energy, an economic downturn, coupled with possible social unrest due to the continuing drastic COVID-19 lockdowns in China, which are occurring still on a massive scale. Growth has slowed sharply, and questions whether China has reached its peak are becoming more frequent, just at the time that Chairman Xi Jinping is expected to receive an unprecedented third term at the Party Congress in October. US-Russia relations will be on ice for a very, very long time. There will be no Russian pivot to the West. Mutual distrust runs deep. Arms control discussions, let alone negotiations, are suspended. Strategic stability is a distant goal. Yet there are issues which are dangerous to leave alone for too long. Not only arms control, but I can think of counterterrorism, I can think of outer space, I think of cyber threats, I think of the Arctic, and I think of the climate. All these issues are transnational. They do not respect borders, and all of them need cooperation, all of them need dialogue. They need a continuing exchange among officials, among academia, civil society, possibly or hopefully leading to agreements. In Europe right now, we're living through a very unstable situation. With Sweden and Finland having recently joined NATO, the transatlantic military alliance has become more muscular and assertive, and also more robustly funded. Neutrality, a long-cherished ideal in Europe, has receded into the background as military threats have increased. The rupture of ties with Russia carry great risk. There's a line down the middle of Europe, similar to what existed during the Cold War, with an empowered and cohesive NATO standing on one side, confronted by a Russian buildup that defends its, what they call, near abroad, and what it sees as its traditional sphere of influence. The war in Ukraine not only affects Ukraine, the states in the former Soviet Union or behind the Iron Curtain, Poland, Moldova, the Baltic states, fear that Russian aggression could next be directed against them. Complicating the situation is the dependence of Europe on Russian energy supplies. No one had expected that the intertwining of pipelines built at great expense and with the expectation of reliable energy supplies for decades to come would suddenly collapse, and that a scramble would ensue to find alternative energy resources, while at the same time dealing with efforts to control global warming and climate change, whose effects are becoming very starkly apparent, battering already weakened economies. Dwindling government resources due to COVID-19 are shrinking further, due to an economic downturn and also due to rising inflation. At the same time, subsidies for impoverished populations are needed, precisely because of inflation and higher food prices. Other concerns are drastic climate change requirements, in addition to absorbing a large number of refugees leaving Ukraine for neighboring countries to the west. And refugees and migrants from Africa and other regions are also knocking on Europe's doors, still seeing it as a continent of wealth and plenty. All this makes for a very volatile situation, as Europeans, who are long used to yearly growing prosperity and a high sense of security, feel they now live in a dangerous world, beset by a variety of problems which are ever more complex and interdependent, and over which they have very little agency. At the same time, our existing collective security mechanisms are under strain. Many of the agreements and crisis management tools that were developed in the United Nations, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, are no longer fit for the task. They were not made for a situation like we're finding ourselves in now. New domains of conflict have opened up, where we do not have strong sets of rules to govern them. New rules need to be developed. The international information space, and particular social media, is increasingly being distorted and weaponized, dividing the political discourse. The European Union has always been a defender of global human rights values. They've always promoted a human-centered approach to growth, decent living standards, healthcare, access to education, adequate minimum wage levels. Will and can this approach be maintained? We are already witnessing a me-first approach when it comes to energy supplies and hosting of refugees. EU solidarity is hard to manage, and without a strong Franco-German alliance, and let me say that Scholz is no Merkel, it's much harder to pull together. Military security in Europe is inextricably linked to the geopolitics of major power relations. How can the EU, even in a period of increased tension and minimal trust, increase its ability to design ways and means to coexist in the space that binds them together, regardless of the outcome of the war in Ukraine? In a paper that he wrote for the European Leadership Network, Ian Anthony reminds us that Europe has several institutions available to facilitate security dialogue, provided states choose to use them. Yet Russia's primary focus is the United States and NATO as the only European institution with a security mandate. And Russia speaks to European capitals, particularly Berlin and Paris, but does not show interest in the EU as a dialogue partner for security. I believe that the focus has to be wider than military and security issues, even if they are now the eye of the storm and will probably remain so for a long time. But what Anthony calls low-level discussions, particularly in the context of confidence and security building measures, the space for dialogue needs to be safeguarded, even if that space for diplomacy has shrunk. Eventually, diplomats and politicians will sit around a table to define new borders, to define new behaviors, to define rules and regulations, even if that sounds very unlikely right now. Anthony also points to the possibility within the OSCE participating states to conclude bilateral agreements and asks if they can be supplemented and be made more useful, rather than being missed as fair weather agreements that are peripheral at best. This is a very interesting idea, I find. He attaches great importance to the signaling that goes from these agreements and says, by way of an example, for Poland, bilateral agreements with Belarus and Ukraine were a signal that NATO membership did not reduce the appetite for dialogue and cooperation with a neighbor on military issues. Still, the agreements might work well in peacetime, but periods of tension reveal the shortcomings. This showed in late 2021 with accusations by Belarus of unusual and provocative military actions against both Ukraine and Poland. I'm mentioning the bilateral agreements concluded under OSCE auspices because I believe that not enough is being done to think about next steps. What can we actually do? What can we achieve? Because so far, the situation represents a very gloomy picture. So now I come to the second part, and that's what does that mean for the developments on the Korean Peninsula? In a bipolar world, states must choose and take positions on where they stand, with the US or with China. The Republic of Korea has already made its position very clear. The US-South Korea alliance has been a long-standing military alliance, but it is an alliance of two. Even if high-level defense talks in Seoul in July agreed to further strengthen trilateral security cooperation with Japan. For Korea, the threat comes from the DPRK's nuclear threats and missile tests, as well as what they called regional challenges, which, while left undefined, clearly refer to the Indo-Pacific region and the Taiwan Strait. Under the leadership of Chairman Xi Jinping, China has begun to more aggressively challenge the role of the US as a key economic and political power in Asia. China is robustly asserting its regional influence, its challenging trade routes, positioning itself as a power broker with North Korea, and using the Belt and Road Initiative to spread its influence well beyond Asia. Foreign Minister Wang Yi has already made over 30 trips abroad this year, trumpeting the trips as evidence of China's growing influence in the region and abroad. History is important here. The United States has been the predominant global power for generations, wielding influence and bending events to her will. The US has military bases in 85 countries. As a global latecomer, China has 3, and Russia has 1, and that's in Latakia, Syria. This has formed China's narrative and frequent complaints about the US meddling in regions far beyond North America. Recognizing the challenges from China, the July high-level US ROK meeting stated, and I quote, "The two leaders reaffirmed the importance of adherence to a rule-based international order based on international laws and norms, including those of freedom of navigation and overflight, and pledged close cooperation to meet regional challenges." And it further continued, "The linchpin for peace and prosperity in the region, the alliance has grown far beyond the Korean Peninsula, reflecting the pivotal role of our countries as global leaders in democracy, economy, and technology." And it says, finally, "The Republic of Korea and the United States are unified in common determination to deepen and broaden our political, economic, security, and people-to-people ties." This is an observation that is worth reflecting on. In Asia, illiberate forces have risen. Prime Minister Modi of India has reshaped India and strengthened Hindu nationalism. In the Philippines, former President Duterte has undermined the country's democratic institutions and the rule of law. His successor's policies, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., are still in the shaping. Myanmar's military seized power in February last year from a democratically elected government and is brutally cracking down on dissident voices. In contrast, South Korea and Japan are models of democratic institutions and liberalism, though of course every democratically elected government faces challenges. Coming back to the question of European peace and implications, for Korea, I see important differences. From a democratic standpoint, Europe as a region is more cohesive in terms of democracy and respect for rule of law and human rights, though Hungary and Poland in particular pose challenges to EU-accepted norms. Yet the security situation is exclusively linked to the transatlantic alliance, namely NATO, as the European Security Partnership, which the acronym is PESCO, has not matured. And given this year's developments, one wonders whether it ever will. The European Union includes several neutral states. It surrounds Switzerland, which is not an EU member, while the Balkan states have EU candidate status, except for Slovenia and Croatia, which are members. EU expansion has been put on hold, yet the Russian invasion of Ukraine has prompted new thinking and given new impetus for considering enlarging the Union. None of this is happening, nor do I see it happen, in Northeast Asia. In Europe, cohesion started with economic cooperation, then broadened to security and human rights issues. It was a long process, but the will to overcome divisions was strong, and ultimately it became a dialogue of the similar-minded between nations which had fought each other in war and which had the ultimate goal of avoiding carnage and death. The European leaders who shaped the EU had known firsthand the havoc that war had wrought. The leaders of today are from a post-war generation. They have come to take peace for granted. The invasion of Ukraine has been a rude awakening, and the stark effects of the energy crisis, coupled with climate change challenges, have upset the rosy view of harmonious coexistence. In Northeast Asia, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is a constant destabilizing factor, particularly for the Republic of Korea as well as Japan. The DPRK is able to exert this outsized influence due to the support of China and Russia, which are clearly not interested in curbing Kim Jong-un's ambition as a nuclear power. The UN sanction regime, the harshest for any country in the world, has not achieved its goal, and it is unlikely the sanctions will result in curbing DPRK's political aspirations. And just a few days ago, in a meeting of the Security Council, when sanctions were considered again to be tightened even more, Russia exercised its veto power. Now, it would be presumptuous of me to give any advice or make predictions on what might happen. What I do see, however, is that the G20 summit, to take place in Indonesia later this year, could be a venue for addressing joint concerns. The G20, of which Russia is still a member, will occur after the Chinese Party Congress in October, and Xi Jinping will be extended in office for another 5 years, and he might therefore be more receptive to policy adjustments. Putin has indicated that he will participate, and while Indonesia has identified 3 priority topics for the event that are decidedly non-political, and I'm naming them: global health architecture, digital transformation, and sustainable energy transition, such a summit is a prime opportunity for quiet diplomacy in the margins. I'm sure that leaders will seize the moment to raise also difficult issues that are not on the official agenda. Having worked for many years in the United Nations, I know how effective such face-to-face meetings outside the bright lights of the public, outside of the scrutiny of the press can be. And I hope that such discussions, even if not immediately successful, will bring results and more engagements in the longer run. Dialogue, personal contact, exchanges, engagements, and the willingness to listen to the other side. This is really what we need. So let us hope that we do not have to go through the crucible of war to achieve a more peaceful world. I thank you.
I hope you enjoyed your break. We will now begin the next session. This session will be moderated by Chung-In Moon, Chairman of the Sejong Institute, and will include presentations by Won-Soo Kim, former UN Under-Secretary General, and Markku Heiskanen, former senior official of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland, as well as comments from Angela Kane. The session will conclude with a discussion and Q&A. Please join me in welcoming the chairman of the Sejong Institute, Chung-in Moon.
Thank you. I have never seen this generous allocation of time in this kind of setting. 2 hours for 3 presenters. That is really amazingly generous. And therefore, now I have the major challenges here. How can digest those 2 hours, which is 2 major presenters and 1 commentator. But I will do it this way. Okay. We have 1 hour for presentation, but I will give you 10 to 15 minutes each to Marco and Wonsu, and then because Marco has written a piece mostly on the implication for European peace, and Wons has written most exclusively on the implication for the Korean Peninsula, and then Angela make some kinds of comments on their presentations. Okay, and then I'll be asking a set of questions. Okay, then we will be able to consume 1 hour, and then I'll open to the floor. But our panel discussion will exceed more than an hour, and then I will allocate about 30 to 40 minutes from the floor. But I know that Glenn Ford will be very much interested in raising questions because he was a member of European Parliament. And Ki Park, even though he's a medical doctor dealing with North Korea, but he has been curious on all these international affairs. Therefore, the Ki Park may intervene, and also President Song Nam-sun might have some questions and comments, and also Professor Jung-eun Lee. They will be giving a presentation tomorrow on how to engage North Korea. But Dean Eun-jung Lee of Free University Berlin has been dealing with North Korea for the past almost 2 decades. Therefore, we have a really good the folks in the floor, and also President Sang Hyun-lee. He's one of the supreme experts on Korean security issues. Therefore, you're welcome to make comments. And also, we have several reporters here. Please feel free to raise your questions. It is very often is like a townhouse meeting kinds of things. Okay. Now then, I will invite Won-soo Kim. Let me introduce about Won-soo Kim. He was a Director General of policy, the security policy and policy coordination at the ROK Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And afterwards, he joined the then Foreign Minister Ban Ki-moon when Ban Ki-moon became Secretary General of the United Nations, and he was a Deputy Chef de Cabinet of Office of Secretary General. And afterwards, he became the Undersecretary for Disarmament. Therefore, Won-soo and Angela, they are so-called, they are in the kinship. They were in charge of UN's disarmament, bureau, and after that, the ones came back to Korea. Now he's working for Tae Academy, but he's most articulate expert in world affairs and United Nations affairs, as well as Korean Peninsula issues. Therefore, I'm very lucky to have Ambassador Won-soo Kim. Let us give a big applause to him. Marco Haskanen is, you may not know him, but we all know him because he has been working very extensively on the European peace. He was one of the key, the living witness to the Helsinki process, and then he was head of Finn delegation to setting up the overall agenda at the Helsinki process. Therefore, he played a very important role in setting up the security cooperation in Europe, as well as the formation of Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. And afterward, he has been working Ambassador James Guppy, who was American Ambassador to Finland, as well as a representative Helsinki process. Therefore, Ambassador James Guppy and Marco have been working very closely over the past 30, almost 40 years on the issue of European security, as well as European security cooperation. Therefore, it is very fortunate for us to have Marco here. As to Angela, our moderator, explained her, but she is she is, Madame United Nations. Okay? She held the 3 undersecretary position at the United Nations. She was Undersecretary General at the headquarters, and she was the Undersecretary General in charge of disarmament and the peacekeeping operations. Therefore, she is very well known, UN expert in the world. But now she's based in Vienna, and she's now Vice President of Vienna Institute of International Peace Studies, and also she is a senior advisor to Nuclear Threat Initiative in Washington, D.C., and she's also, she has so many titles. She is also a distinguished professor at Tsinghua University's, Schwartz, anyway, Tsinghua University. Therefore, she is so well known throughout the world. Therefore, it's very, very fortunate for the DMZ Forum to feature this, outstanding speakers today. Okay, then we'll start with Won-Soo. You have 10 to 15 minutes to talk about your preparation.
Thank you, first of all, to our moderator, Professor Jung-in Moon, for very generous introduction. But before I start, I also want to say 3 things. First to our host, Sejong Institute and President Lee Sang-hyun, and also Free University of Berlin, and other sponsors. My second thanks should go to participants from Korea, but also from abroad, who came all the way. And I think maybe we are now resuming our travel for the first time, maybe after 2.5-year break. And I saved the best for last, because I'm so happy to meet again my old, but not age-wise, but still very young and active friends, starting with my predecessor, Angela. Welcome to Seoul. And I don't recall we sit next to each other to address the same issue, because she gave the baton to me at the UN for disarmament. And also, of course, Marco, also great to see you again, and Mr. Glinford, whom I met Seoul, New York, maybe London as well, many places. So great to see you all again. Because I already circulated paper, so I don't think I have to go through all those points. And I will just try to summarize my key points. And I like to pick up where Angela left off on the implications of Russian invasion of Ukraine, particularly to Korean Peninsula. I agree with her that the implications are much deeper than the public and Korean media interest on this issue, because media interest tends to focus on political, economic, and humanitarian consequences. But I believe there are 3 deep strategic implications for Korea. First of all, as Angela also referred to, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine shows that now geopolitical tectonic shifts are happening along the global fault lines between the 2 camps, one led by US and the West, the other led by Russia and China. So although we see Ukraine at the other end, but if we sit Ukraine, Caucasus, Middle East, South Asia, South China Sea, East China Sea, and Korean Peninsula, it is very long arc of instability now emerging. So we have to remember what is happening there can happen to us anytime. Maybe because of the combination of misjudgment, miscalculation, or even miscommunication. So that's the first, I believe, very big strategic implication for Korea. The second implication is that Russian invasion somehow resurrect the ghost of a nuclear war, maybe even beginning of the nuclear winter. For the first time, the war started by a country which possesses maybe the largest amount of nuclear arsenal, and they are using the threat of nuclear retaliation against any country, even intervening with the conventional forces. And third implication for Korea, a big global implication, is also it puts, I think, a first very serious stress test to US administration's policy. President Biden's declared a pivot to Asia. Although Washington was quick to reassure the allies in Asia that they are willing and ready to fight to defend Asian allies, and also they are capable, they reassure us, capable of fighting two-front contingency, one in Europe and maybe the other in Asia. But again, the credibility of those commitments must be translated into real action. Because many analysts blame this growing rivalry between US and China is caused by the rise of China. But also, it is not complete if we don't look at the power vacuum being created by the restructuring of US overseas commitments. US withdrawal from Afghanistan was a prime example. So those who have irredentist agenda to change the status quo along the fault line may be tempted to test US resolve and exploit the power vacuum. So those are the three global strategic implications, I believe, to Korea. Next, I want to also point out three uncertainties. First uncertainty, of course, nobody knows how and when Russian invasion will end. Many factors are involved, and still it is unpredictable. And the longer it lasts, the harder it will become, not only for the peoples of Ukraine and Russia, but also for Europe and even those in the developing world who are already suffering from growing shortage of food and fuel. The second uncertainty is in our region, Korean Peninsula, and also in the vicinity of our region. Some of the players may learn the wrong lessons from Ukraine, and they may miscalculate or misjudge US resolve and also our resolve. So that means we have to be prepared for the worst case scenario. But also at the same time, we have to make the best effort to narrow down that scope for misunderstanding. And third uncertainty is growing US-China rivalry. It puts almost every country, including Korea and Europe, in a difficult position. And the more that rivalry gets intense, the harder and the more unpredictable how it will be played out. So I believe Korea and our European partners share the same interest in trying to put US and China in a sort of I'm using US terminology here, compete within the agreed guardrails. It means we have to make them, at least, I don't know whether we can succeed, but at least we have to try to make them do their best in managing their competition responsibly and in a peaceful manner. Of course, these tasks are very tough. It is tougher for Korea because we are surrounded by much bigger neighbors. But still, I believe this challenge can be an opportunity for Korea because Korea is in a rare position to talk to both US and China. So, what should be done? Again, I see 3 tasks for Korea. The first task is to define a comprehensive strategy for the future, of course, for Korea, but also for our region and beyond, combining both deterrence and diplomacy. Of course, I mean, this is very basic, but when we are facing tough challenges, we have to get back to the basics. And diplomacy must cover 3 challenges Korea is facing. First of all, those Korean challenges, including nuclear problem and other peace-related issues. Secondly, US-China rivalry and how we can help them at least start some sort of a dialogue, at least starting from crisis management mechanism, so that unintended incident should not be escalated into unwanted, unintended, inadvertent full confrontation. That requires hotlines must be maintained. Not just hotlines, but they have to talk to each other to understand each other's intention when an incident breaks out. And also, they have to reshape their strategic dialogue. And they can start from issues where they have low political differences, but high political consequences, like climate crisis, global pandemic. If global pandemic occurs again, what to do? And WMD, and nexus between WMD and terrorism. So that's, I think, Korea's task. Then secondly, that comprehensive strategy covering both deterrence and diplomacy must be conveyed to the whole Korean people across party lines. We need domestic consensus on any policy we want to adopt and implement. Otherwise, nobody will take our voice seriously. Because as long as we are divided, why they care? They think maybe half of Korean people doesn't support this policy. So securing domestic consensus is a must to make any strategy we are going to adopt more effective. And thirdly, we have to mobilize our proactive creativity. Because we can think, and we can talk, we can do things differently, particularly vis-a-vis our bigger neighbors, including in particular US and China. Thank you so much. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Won-soo. That's great. Okay, Marco.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm very happy and honored to be here again in South Korea and in Seoul. My first visit to South Korea was quite a long time ago. It was 1977 when I was serving at the embassy of Finland in Tokyo, and we were accredited to South Korea. I must say that South Korea in 1977 and 2022, two different worlds. Yes, the paper, my presentation has been distributed in written, so I think I'm going to speak about some more personal experiences than starting to explain what the Helsinki process contains. But when Professor Moon Chung-in asked me about the title that I should say, speak about, is the Helsinki process dead? Helsinki process, which means briefly a process called Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and then the present organization of European OSCE, Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. I contacted my former boss, Ambassador Iloniemi, who recently filled 90, and asked that what would he was he was leading the Helsinki and CSC process in early and mid 1970s. And I said that, what would you say, is the Helsinki process dead? He said that he would say that it's in a state of hibernation. Hibernation, I hope you know what it means. It means you can say that, yes, it is dead, but it can be survived. I think the Helsinki process ended on the 24th February in the morning. I was not the only one who woke at 5 o'clock in the morning and opened my mobile phone and say, so, my God, now they have attacked Ukraine. Well, this reinvasion and war in Ukraine has changed fundamentally the European security system. And as Angela Kane mentioned in the morning in her paper, so Finland and Sweden have long been natural and traditional neutral countries, Sweden historically and Finland more in practice. It took quite a long time before Finnish neutrality was recognized by then Soviet Union, when recently deceased Gorbachev was in Finland. But then I think I'm not going to speak too much about the European developments, because we are now in Korea, but rather refer to what the Helsinki process, and which I call Helsinki spirit, or spirit of Helsinki, could mean. There's an interesting thing that many people don't know, that the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement of 1992 was based partly on the Helsinki Treaty model of 1975, but unlike Europe, Korea lacks practical experience and multilateral security cooperation. Well, Helsinki spirit, I have some personal experiences how it works here in this part of the world. In 2002, in Helsinki, I was then chairman of the Finland Northeast Asia Trade Association, and we planned to organize a Eurasian Railway Symposium. The idea was to study the railway connections between Europe and Northeast Asia, the northern part of Eurasia. And the starting point was like when we started the negotiations towards the European Security Conference. We thought we could invite a few people from here and there. And finally, in April 2002, there were 13 countries represented unofficially in Helsinki, among them North and South Korean delegations. And just a moment. Okay, then the spirit of Helsinki. This was, frankly, and literally speaking, in April 2002. 2003 in June, the two railway corridors across the DMZ between North and South Korea were reconnected. Then 2007, I remember that was 17th of May, I was in Pyongyang and I witnessed on the TV how the first trains crossed after the Korean War crossed the DMZ. And for some time, I think until the end of 2007, there was even regular train traffic between North and South Korea. I think that this is one example of the positive spirit, what can lead to concrete results. Then I must keep in mind that even if Europe and the European Union has had only limited role in promoting peace in Korea or the Korean Peninsula, we must remember the six-party talks, which were quite positive to a certain extent. And then there have been also some other important events where Europe and European Union has been contributing to peace here. But last but not least, what I think our opinion far from Northeast Asia is that you should try to start, or let's say continue, a multilateral process where the major countries of Northeast Asia, including the United States, is included. And the starting point could be very modest, as it was 50 years ago. I was a young official of the foreign ministry in 1972 when we were gathered in Espoo, close to Helsinki, and there were the potential participating states of CSCE, and it was called a Tea Party. There were ambassadors accredited to Helsinki, including then East and West Germany. And so we didn't have any goals. We just sat down and said that something should be done to guarantee peace, to avoid war breaking out again in Europe. And then patiently, we started then in 1973. There was a foreign ministers meeting in Helsinki. Then the process, 2 years process about in Geneva, and I was member of the Finnish delegation, and then the summit in Helsinki in 1975, which was a big event in that time of Europe. But the CSCE process, it has had its positive contribution to keeping peace in Europe, and at least indirectly it also caused to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and independence of former so-called communist states in Europe. So I think the lesson from Europe is that we have been now living in peace 77 years, but now close to our frontiers in Finland, it's only 400 kilometers from the southern frontier of Finland to Ukraine. Now we have a war, and we have been reacting very fast. The Russian invasion started in February, and now it's a question of a few months. Finland and Sweden are becoming full members of NATO. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marco. Okay, Angela, would you make some comments on those two presentations, one on Europe and one on Korea?
Thank you very much, Jung-in. And let me just sort of say, just like Won-Soo, I'm absolutely thrilled to be sitting here with two good friends. Marco, I'm sorry we didn't really know each other beforehand, but our moderator, Professor Moon, and I go back some time, and also as co-chairs of the World Economic Forum on the regional Council on the Korean Peninsula. We also have one eminent member here, and that's Key Park, who was a member, so we very much enjoyed cooperating on that. Then, of course, Won-Soo and I, and again, we've never sat next to each other and sort of commented on the situation, but it's a great pleasure to actually see that, and I'm delighted to have that. And of course, I also welcome very much Marco's paper, which was very interested, and thank you for your observations. These papers are very different, so I'm going to comment on them one by one. And one of the aspects that I wanted to mention, and this is really important because Won-Soo talked about the tremendous impact that a veto-yielding member of the Security Council basically just prevents any opportunity for cooperation because there is the veto. And let's sort of say it's not only the Russian Federation, but it's also China, which has either joined the veto or has abstained, including also India, which has abstained. Of course, it doesn't have the veto, but even the abstention is very meaningful. Now, what I find interesting when you look at that in terms of what has happened in the UN is when 24 February first happened, of course, there was no possibility to get anything moving in the Security Council as a condemnation, even a presidential statement, much less a resolution. So what happened is it moved to the General Assembly. And the General Assembly was actually quite robust in the initial phases when, as a response to the invasion. But on the other hand, as you've seen over the past 7 months, it's basically become non-existent as an actor in this. And that, I think, is also very meaningful that we must remember, because what it shows is that there is a cohesion of action on the parts of the member states. And that I attribute also, and you referred a lot to China, for example, I refer a lot to China's efforts to basically put a lot of the countries, particularly in Africa, into their pocket because of assistance that they have gotten and because of the indebtedness that they have basically focused on, particularly in African countries. So they don't really want to confront them, or they don't want to upset them in that sense. And what I also must observe when I look at China, for example, and Won-Soo will remember this since we were both at the UN at the same time. When you look at China, 10 years ago, China was still a group of 77 and China. China did not have an independent opinion in many cases, but it kind of aligned itself with a group of 77. It set back on many of the issues, but it joined the larger consensus, not really making independent statements of its own. That has dramatically changed with the economic ascent and also the political growing upness, if I can call it that, in the recent years, and also because China is now the second most powerful and paying member in financial terms to the UN regular budget. So it has really gained a stature that can no longer afford it to basically sit back, join the group of 77 and join the consensus there, but rather has to become more forthcoming in terms of what it is. And that aligns itself, like what you also pointed out, in terms of a political maturity, if I can call it that, as an independent actor. But the other point that you make, and I kind of underlined this in your paper, and that is basically that there is no experience by China in multilateral negotiations. And that is, I'm not talking about the Security Council, but for example, when you talk about arms control negotiations, China has never engaged in those discussions. Remember, there was a big attempt by former President Trump to bring China to the table together with Russia, and basically China's position has always been, no, once you come up to our level of nuclear weapons, which is very low, then basically we will engage. But they've never engaged in multilateral negotiations on any of these important issues. That, I think, is very meaningful because, negotiation is also kind of a muscle that you exercise, and that muscle does not seem to be strengthened enough there. So that's extremely important. Now, you also spoke about, Won-Soo, about the United States, and I think that there is a lot of very good points that you are making because you're saying there's a large arc of instability, but part of it is also attributed, or largely attributed, let's say, to the United States. I agree with that. And I think that that is a very pertinent observation. The difficulty that I see, and I've just spent a year in Washington, being very close to everything that goes on in the United States, obviously, is that the space for President Biden, domestically, is so limited that he just really can't move. He was tremendously criticized. You mentioned the withdrawal from Afghanistan. He was tremendously criticized for the very abrupt nature, the very unruly nature in which it took place, unplanned nature. And of course, that withdrawal was predicated already by President Trump. And he basically had, said that he was going to follow up on it, and he did. But on the other hand, we also must know, and you've, at the later part of your statement, you talk about, the Korean people need to be unified and they need to have a consensus of opinion, which is extremely important. The United States does not have a consensus of opinion. They have two camps that are very, very divided. Let's not forget, I think it was Trump got 70 million votes and Biden got 74 million votes or something. That's not a large difference, for a big country like that. So you have a very divided opinion, which gives Biden very little leeway to actually maneuver politically, because he won't be allowed to basically do that. So that power vacuum that is left behind, I think, is really, very, very strong. But I'm not quite sure that President Biden at this point has it in his power to fill that vacuum by being more robust. He also has to play to the domestic audience, and you mentioned the domestic audience being so important. It's important for any politician. But I think these days it's particularly important in the United States, because who does he play for? I mean, does he play for the Republicans? There's a lot of a domestic agenda that he is fighting for, and that also distracts from being able to engage in a political, let's say, in a foreign, if I can call it that. And foreign policy has never been very high on the political agenda of the United States to begin with. So that limits his ability to really engage much more strongly on foreign policy matters than I think that he would have liked or he would have wished, because as you remember, he was so many years, he was a member of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, so he's got wide experience in foreign affairs in there. Now, you also mentioned, and I thought very pertinent, the threats of nuclear retaliation against an intervening power, and of course I had mentioned the P5 making the statement in January only about the Reagan-Gorbachev reiteration, so that's extremely important. But on the other hand, I think that went very quickly out by the wayside in terms of what actually was the promise made and how was that done. And again, when you talk about the, I don't want to comment on your recommendations for Korea because I'm not the expert on that. I leave that up to you. But on the other hand, how can the world chip in diplomatically to help mediate the way out? I think that is something that is very limited right now. And I think that the Ukrainian people are dependent on the military supplies that they are receiving. And that's going to continue. One wonders how long it's going to continue. I think that the amounts that are being spent on military material and other equipment that goes, which has clearly shifted the balance in favor of Ukraine, as we've seen just a couple of days ago, which is very important. And I think that no one wants to step back and say it's not going to continue, but I think at one point, we are 7 months into this now, at one point there's going to come a diversion to the extent like, where do we go from here and what can we do? Now, what I liked also is your recommendation that you sort of say Korea needs to nurture the habit of dialogue in the region. And my question, of course, comes to with whom? With whom do you dialogue? You don't really have a lot of natural partners, in this whole area. So I think that is something that I find very meaningful, but one has to really look at the wider forum to say, who are going to be our dialogue partners, in addition to the ones where can you find more support. But it is a very pertinent observation, and I really like that. So that's finishes one Sue's paper, sorry. Let me go to the next one, and that is, thank you very much, Marco, for doing that. I like the hibernation expression. I did like that a lot. I mean, let's not say something is dead. We've always sort of gone through cycles at the UN, UN is dead, it's ineffective. No, it's not dead. Maybe it kind of goes into retreat occasionally, but hibernation is a good part. Now, well, you have in Germany, you have this fairy tale about, the Dornröschen, which falls into a big slumber, and then comes the prince and kisses it awake, for those of you who follow German fairy tales. But I also like the point that you made about the railway. And I think this is something that I find very meaningful, because we talked this morning in the other keynote. In the morning they talked about the soft projects and the soft possibilities, like is there a way to engage? And I like that a lot, because I know railway, yes, I mean there is the possibility to continue. It also reminds me of the Belt and Road Initiative, from that China has started, because in essence it's the same thing, except it may not be by railway, it may be by road, but on the other hand it is a way of basically, rolling for them the red carpet and the cooperation. But I do like the fact that there is a way to cooperate, and maybe railway is one of the possibilities that could be done. And again, the security cooperation that you talk about is again with China one that I think is very much lacking on the part of China, because they haven't engaged in this kind of thing. But you could start, in addition to the railway, you could start with climate change. Like I also said in my paper about transnational issues. And you also mentioned the Arctic, for example. I think the Arctic is going to be an issue that is very politically significant for the next couple of years. And China has already registered, and Finland of course, but China's already registered as an observer, and they call themselves a near-Arctic power. I'm not quite sure what that means. Maybe Germany is also a near-Arctic power. But on the other hand, there is like this political and also military buildup that's clearly becoming now possible because of the thawing of the Arctic. But you have to start somewhere. And I like the climate change. I like the railroad. I like sort of finding ways of engaging, that we find a dialogue, that we find an entry point into the dialogue that I think is really, really important. And it was important that you outlined also in your paper the 4 different baskets that the Helsinki process had, because it really was empowering for people to focus not on one issue, and that was the issue of peace, as we heard this morning, but to focus on 4 aspects that were all different parts of a coin. And that is something where people can engage on one part or the other. So you don't go in tandem on all of these things, but you make different progress in very different areas. So I think that was very, very important. Now, the human rights was a very crucial aspect of the Helsinki Forum. And that, to my mind, is a bit more difficult in Asia. And the way that I see it is because you don't have, in Asia, the countries don't have a common perception of what human rights should be. And I don't know how you're going to find that, but it's a topic that really needs to be raised. But there are very different approaches to what does human rights mean in my country. What does it mean for me? How do I go about it? And again, China comes in there, of course, big time, because their human rights aspects are very different from what I think many countries see that. So there's no cohesive view of what human rights are. And looking at the OSCE itself, I think we cannot be shying away from the fact of looking also what happened in the Ukraine. The OSCE has had missions in Ukraine for many years. So there are also problems that existed prior to 2014 or prior to the situation now. And those problems were not addressed. I think there was a lot of help given by OSCE. There was a lot of help given by other countries. But the Ukraine did not always address those problems proactively or solve them in many ways. And I think just if you think about the corruption issue, was a major issue. And I think we shouldn't shy away from also looking at that and say, fine, what can we learn from that? Would there have been a way of addressing this beforehand? Would there have been a way of looking at this now? What can we do so it doesn't continue as a problem after this invasion is over? The other aspect that you raised, and that was basically the response by people, by the common people, to the Helsinki process, to the various baskets, etc. And you have talked about increased civil society activism. Very important. But when you look at what's happening in Russia right now, I saw a list this morning about prominent oligarchs and people who have somehow fallen out of windows or shot themselves or something. And also because you can be incarcerated very quickly and arrested very quickly if you just even utter a word. So civil society activism, particularly in Russia, I think is out of the question right now. It's just not possible to go there, and it's very unclear as to whether it would be possible to actually support that, because you don't want to put people in a danger zone. And when you talk about the conclusions and what we can do, I think I still go back to the fact that we do need new tools. I don't know that we can wake up out of hibernation the bear that is now the OSCE, but on the other hand, I do think we need to think a little bit more creatively. Is there anything else that we can add in terms of the toolkit? And to my mind, again, and I bring up what I mentioned, is the bilateral possibility that we have seen, also under the OSCE forum, that I like rather, but we need to think about that. So, Sejong Institute is a think tank, so one welcomes, of course, putting this out to studies, putting it out to researchers to say, what can you contribute in this? So I think that these were two important contributions to this conference, and I thank you both for making them.
Angela, thank you very much for your very thoughtful comments. Now, Wonsu and Marco, you can, respond to, Angela's, comments. Then we'll open to the, public debate.
I counted number of comments you raised for me and for him. I think 7 even. But I will pick up some of the points and I'll try to answer them. First of all, on the need and also realistic possibility of U.S.-China dialogue. I agree, it's very low, particularly until after picture gets clearer in China, and also at least until after U.S. midterm election is done. So I think we have to prepare the grounds now, maybe respectively with U.S. and China, using think tank networks, preparing for the possibility of 1.5 dialogue until after those dust are settled on both sides. Because once leadership succession change starts from party congress in October, and then the next level succession will become clearer until March next year, until they have joint session. So until that time, I don't think even Chinese scholars feel free to talk. And also because they are on the pandemic restrictions, and now most of them are participating in any dialogue, any forum through online. So it is pretty much scripted talking points. So not much can be expected. But still, we can cultivate that network with the Chinese think tanks for the future resumption of the dialogue. That's my first comment. And the second comment on the need for multilateral security dialogue in our region, with whom? And there, although we have tried and also we failed, we tried, and also a lot of errors made, but also a lot of reflection is being done on 3-party process, 4-party process, and 6-party process. So still, I think a 6-party process should be the backbone. So we have to resurrect it. But then we have a very inherent political constraint that has been that unless North Korea says yes, China and Russia even do not agree even to meeting and talking. So when we think about multilateral security dialogue, I hope we have to make it, hopefully for the future, habit of dialogue as a rule. Because we have wasted so much time to talk about the talks. And it is not just with North Korea, but also between Korea, Japan, China, Korea, Japan, and US. whenever we have some bilateral problems occurring, then even we cannot agree on when to meet. And this must be rectified. And we have to make a rule. If any party has a problem, they refuse to come, but others should come to meet while leaving door open to all. So I hope when we resume six-party process, I hope also the agenda should be expanded, not only on nuclear and peace-related issues, but also we have so many transnational challenges occurring in our region. So agenda should be expanded. And also we have to think about adding, for example, European Union, as European Union did on JCPOA with Iran. Because of EU's contribution, although US pulled out, it is not dead. And now it is being resurrected. So I think also we have to learn the lesson from European undertakings. So that's my additional point. And lastly, I agree with Angela very much that we have to think about what can be the realistic entry points for any dialogue on strategic arms reduction or crisis management or on human rights. So we have to think creatively and seriously what can be the entry point with the parties which have different agenda, different thinking. And when I visited with the DPA to North Korea, we give very serious thought about how we can raise human rights issues, for example. And then I learned also again from a European experience, because when EU visited North Korea, they agreed to have human rights dialogue with the EU. So a formula we thought is to use universal periodic review mechanism, to which North Korea already joined twice, China as well. So all countries joined universal periodic review on their human rights record. And also, universal periodic review produced a lot of recommendations. So we can use it as an entry point on talking about human rights. So I think if we think creatively, still a lot of entry points can be identified. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, there was one important thing I didn't mention in my presentation. The European Union was a member of KEDO, Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, which to a certain extent I think was a success story. And we know more or less why it came to an end. But I think that's something like Ambassador Hilonen said, hibernation. I think that could be survived again. And European Union was very important and constructive actor in that process. And as for my own country, so Finland was the first individual member of KEDO, and then later on when we were represented through the European Commission, so Finland was no more individual member but part of Europe. So there have been several articles we have been writing with Ambassador James Goodby, who is a good colleague of Professor Moon and myself, and we have been suggesting that most recently in a journal of Asia-Pacific Leadership Forum that these elements which have been experienced successful should be utilized again. We need not start from square one. On the other hand, I have explained and stressed on many occasions that Europe cannot be a teacher who says what you should do. But if you can make use of our experiences, OSCE, CSC and OSCE was a certain success story, undeniably. Now the Ukraine war has changed the whole picture, and we don't know where we are going. But anyway, even if it's very, very dramatic war in Ukraine, it's still a limited war. And now we must do all we can to prevent it from becoming a wider, not universal conflict. So I think that we had a very good discussion, and thank you for your comments and your comments too. Thank you very much.
Okay, now I have several questions. Okay, I'll be asking some common questions and some specialized questions. Now, since this session about the Ukrainian war and its implications, first, what is your prediction on the ending of Ukrainian war? Now, Ukrainian forces have retaken some portions of northeast, and they are likely to take over some portions in the southern part of Ukraine. And now President Zelensky has been arguing that he had regained about 2,000 square kilometers of the land which were taken by Russia. Okay, now I'll ask Angela, what is your bet? How long the war will continue, and then who will be winning the war, and what will be the final form of the ending the war?
I think this is an extremely interesting question, and I've never hesitated to voice an opinion, but I am a little bit reluctant to put a timeline on this. What I find very interesting is that basically what we have seen, and I'm very impressed, I must say, with the performance of the Ukrainian military. I think it surprised everyone. And yes, they've had tremendous advantage by receiving the material, the military means to basically fight this war. But I think we must also recognize that these were not soldiers that were highly trained in using those weapons. You had a lot of civilians who were drafted. In fact, they were forcibly drafted, and they were basically thrown into this like, you learn by doing. And I'm very impressed with the way that they have basically risen up and defended their fatherland or motherland, if you so want. So this is very important. What is also important is that I think that the sophistication, the increasing sophistication of the military equipment that they've received has really turned into the Ukrainians' favor. And when I think about, look, we all rely on news reports. So, I don't have any particular intelligence that I can share with you. So I read the papers and I try to inform myself what's going on. But what is really has struck me is that the Russians clearly expected this war to go very differently. They'd overrun Kiev, they'd take Kiev, and that would basically shatter all of the defenses of the Ukrainian government, and therefore it would be an easy win. And they've been bogged down for weeks. They've been stuck. They have lost a lot of the tanks and the weapons and whatever. And they have waged a war that is really like just burning the entire countryside. We've seen that there's now going to be possibly an inventory of the material damage, the human damage that the Ukrainians have suffered. But what you have also seen, and this has just been in the papers a day or two ago, is that they're now getting weapons, mind you, not from China. They're getting weapons from North Korea. I can't imagine that this is going to be very high quality. I'm sorry, I'm just venturing an opinion here. But, on the other hand, if this is what they're reduced to for using on the battlefield, that's pretty bad. And the other aspect that I find is because, Turkey has also vacillated a little bit in their support. They've not been very strongly supporting of NATO. They've kind of held back a bit. But Turkey has very sophisticated drones. And I think that they also have given some of the drones, just like they used, for example, the Armenia-Azerbaijan issue, they could give this to either Ukraine or, Russia, etc., and they haven't. So to my mind, what is going to be important to see is now the Ukrainians have gained a major advantage in terms of gaining back territory. The other important aspect is the bridge to Crimea. Can they cut off Crimea or not? If they cut off Crimea, I think the blow to the morale also of the Russian soldiers, even though it's very limited in terms of what goes beyond the let's say, fighting front and what the people know, because the media is so controlled.
Okay, what is your bet on which party will win, or no win, or to prolong the protracted conflict.
Let
or
me say
which
that
one?
I vote with my heart, and my heart would say Ukraine is going to win. But that's irrespective of what I think is going to happen. What I do think is it's going to go on, I would say, easily for another 6 months or so.
Only 6 months?
No, 6 months. 6
That's
months.
6 months.
Yeah.
That's good news. That will be short war.
Well, we talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think the Cuban Missile Crisis lasted for 13 days. So, we're talking about something
That's a crisis, but this is war,
Yeah.
which is taking place.
Well, look, pass on to my colleagues
Okay,
here.
once
Ask
now.
them what they think.
Okay, now go back to rhetoric of President Zelensky, and he argues that the ultimate victory for Ukraine is to regain all lost territories, meaning what? Getting back Ukraine territory, getting back Luhansk, and they're getting back Donetsk. But all those three areas, Crimea Peninsula, Donetsk, and Luhansk, they are pro-Russian ethnic groups are living there. Is it possible for Ukraine to get those land back? And can the Zelensky win the war by retaking those land? What is your take on that one, since you have been at the United Nations a long time?
I think that question should be answered by Mark.
Just common sense. But what is bad, since you have been dealing with international affairs a long time?
I think what he's saying is wanting to inspire their soldiers.
That's the rhetorics.
Well,
not real strategic objective.
But still, I think he has to show to his people that he's fighting this war to keep the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So I think that goal will remain, maybe, as you said, maybe as a rhetoric, but I think also as a source of inspiration.
Yeah, because Zelensky said that territory is not compromised.
Yes.
Okay, and period. And that being the case, then Russia is not willing to give up so-called those land which is being occupied by the Russian population. Therefore, it is totally incompatible between Moscow and Kiev.
But whenever we look at conflicts, starting from Korean War and also many conflicts we have witnessed in Africa, Middle East, always the most intense fighting occurs before they see the possibility of ceasefire. Because when they see some sort of agreement comes up, then they fight hardest to recover or retain even some inches.
Therefore, now then Ukraine and reached that peak point.
Not yet.
Now they're just moving toward the ceasefire stage.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
But Angela,
So-
you're saying that in 6 months we can see some kind of possibility of ceasefire.
I think that I would like to see a more definitive outcome than a ceasefire, because a ceasefire freezes the current state of affairs, and that will mean inevitably that there's going to be some countries, some part of Ukraine in Russian hands. Don't know what it is, can't speculate on that. But I think the ceasefire, look at what happened with the two Koreas. This is a terrible idea, because basically you're going to have to settle it somehow or another, or you're going to let it go for I don't know how long. And, we've seen that, in the UN, because, we've been involved in a number of operations. And so I would like to see a more definitive outcome. And what I said, it's like every side wants a win. They need to have a win. But what does the win, what does that actually mean? Define it for me. Define it for Ukraine. Ukraine had already, quote, lost Crimea. So, they had already had instability in the borders. Because the thing is that basically it was part, even though there was a Ukrainian SSR, if you remember, as a founding member of the UN, everyone has forgotten about that right now. But on the other hand, there was so much intermarriage between Russians and Ukrainians and, moving between the borders and the various Soviet republics, that it isn't, if I can call it that, ethnically pure. And I don't mean that because no country these days is ethnically pure anymore. But so you have divided loyalties. So what does that really mean? You have to define. Zelensky and his government has to define that. And I think in a way Russia also has to think about what does it mean to have a win.
But usually pessimists would argue that the Ukraine war will be like the Korean War, we have more 70 years of truce, okay? Therefore, prolongation of the conflict. But optimist says, as Angela says, maybe in which 6 months, Russia may burn out. And then Ukraine, with some sort of regaining of the lost territories, there might be ending of the war. That's a positive, so-called optimistic scenario. Wonsu, do you have any take on
One
that
short
point?
comment to what Angela said is, unfortunate reality we learned from observing so many conflicts is that these conflicts tend to get worse than it get better.
Get
So
what?
still, I don't think we see that peak yet.
You haven't seen the peak. Okay, Marco, then let us.
yes,
Ukraine. Let me just ask a different question to you. Okay, Ukraine may not continue the war unless Ukraine it gets support from the United States and the West, European countries. Now, Germany relies 60% of its natural gas from Russia, but Russia cut it off. Okay, and entire EU countries rely about 40% of their natural gas supply on Russia, but Russia is going to cut it off. Now then, Europe will be having the coldest winter in history this winter. Then there could be war fatigue among population in Europe, even the United States, where perhaps one of the reasons why Zelensky has been really taking pitch against those lands is because he wanted to show that we are winning before the midterm election in the United States and some major critical elections in Europe. Okay. Now, to make it short, okay, if that being the case, suppose Europe, including Finland, have the worst winter this year, what would be the consequences of the worst winter under the war in Ukraine?
So Finland is an Arctic country and we have a lot of forests. So if the energy channels are closed, we have a lot of wood to use. So and we are also clothing is made for. Last winter, I think we had minus 30, minus 35 degrees. So no problem. But I think in Germany, for instance, that is a real problem. But I must say that one thing we didn't mention at all in this discussion is President Putin. And now, let's say, the information from Russia, it's very difficult to know what really happens. But the one scenario is that Putin one day will be removed from power in one way or another. The other way can be very drastic. But now it's wait and see. But I cannot predict anything, but I think half a year at least will take, we have half a year at least before anything dramatic change can be made. Then one personal comment. Finland had two wars in 1939, 1944, and there are still people who remember those experiences. And when we see the young boys, young Ukrainian, Russian boys dying for nothing, so it's I think it's just terrible to see. Thank you.
Angela, the question.
Let me just make another comment, because I think this is also pertinent in terms of, you asked what's the situation in Europe. I've gotten back to, from my year in the States, I gotten back to Vienna about a month ago, 6 weeks ago. And what I find very interesting is because, you have real fault lines now in Europe as well. And that was done because Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, basically made a comment about admitting Ukraine into the EU. This is incredibly, no one wants to talk about this publicly, but privately they all talk about this, because they're sort of saying, and particularly in Austria, Austria used to be a huge empire, if you remember, and they took in a lot of the refugees when you had the crisis in '56 in Hungary, and they took a lot of people in the early 90s when the former Yugoslavia, now former Yugoslavia, broke apart. And you know that there are only 2 countries of the former Yugoslavia that are members of the EU, and the other ones have had candidate status for God only knows how long, and they still have visa requirements. They've actually imposed them. And so all of a sudden to sort of say we're opening this up to the Ukraine, and you have to also think about that Europe is facing a recession, as a lot of the countries are, as the US is. And they're sort of saying, who's going to pay for all of this? If this is going to be heaped onto the European Union to pay, there is a backlash that is really, really important here, because the people don't want that. You know, they are willing to help Ukraine, they're willing to support Ukraine, but they're sort of saying there is a limit to this. And I think this is totally underestimated, what an effect this is going to have on Europe. And I'm speaking because, I mean, maybe other than Glyn, you know, on the European continent, no longer EU member, but still, you know, I can speak about that. But it has to be kept in mind that this is also a fault line that we are going to come to, because somehow a decision is going to have to be made. Is this going to happen or not?
But I think that's a very important point. I mean, I was in Prague in June, and one of my Czech friends told me that he was quoting Jewish proverb saying that guests and fish do not last less than more than 3 days, meaning therefore Czech Republic's senior government officials are now accommodating refugees from Ukraine and whatever, but how long would they last? That is a real question. And once, what did you take on that one? To what extent the whole democratic deal can make the Europeans support Ukrainian war and accommodate the refugees from Ukraine? What did you take on that?
I think Europeans are doing extraordinary efforts to accommodate Ukrainian refugees and also support Ukraine in their war fighting and also providing other assistances. And I think the whole Europe sees this as a now European challenge. So that resolve, although there will be difficulties, so maybe public opinion goes up and down depending on the real life difficulties they feel. But I think European solidarity will remain there for time.
But look, the right-wing populist won the election in Sweden, okay, and you have Orhan in Hungary, right populist, and Italy, the extreme rightist will be winning the war. Now she's getting 2/3 of votes. Okay, therefore, in other words, in the aftermath of the Ukrainian war, growing number of right-wing populists who strongly opposed refugees and immigrants, they are taking power. Then what would be the implication? Marco, can you make comments on that one? How about Finland? Use the microphone.
So I think it's a human catastrophe, and I don't know how many Ukrainian refugees we have, but I think tens of thousands anyway. But they are quite well, I think the term in English is domesticated, so that they are learning Finnish and Finnish customs. And then I think Ukraine somehow it has been a friendly country, and I think they are warmly welcome. It's a big tragedy, of course. Thank you.
Now, going back to Angela and once raised the issue of potential nuclear escalation, and its implication for North Korea is great too, because Putin alluded that he could use tactical nuclear weapons, and he really lowered the threshold of nuclear weapons usage, right? Now, what possibility do you see, or under what conditions would Putin actually use nuclear weapons?
You're looking to me, clearly.
Angela first and once later. Yeah.
I think that there was a taboo in a way that was a little bit broken when Trump had a new nuclear doctrine. And the new nuclear doctrine basically said that he, the United States, would be willing to use a nuclear weapon also in the case of, let's say, non-conventional attacks, meaning that it wasn't a nuclear attack. So they wouldn't only retaliate, but they could be proactive in using it. The difficulty that I see is, first of all, you've got smaller nuclear weapons, meaning you've got smaller nuclear bombs. And so maybe there's a temptation to use them because they would be less damaging. I find that an argument that clearly should not prevail at all. But on the other hand, I think that Putin's threat was an empty threat. I do not believe that he would actually resort to using a nuclear weapon, because it's always the question of what is the response going to be. I mean, is then NATO going to say, fine, I mean, we have got the nuclear weapons in several European countries which are within reach, etc. Are we going to retaliate? I think that that threshold is just too high to cross.
How about Won-soo?
Mostly, I agree with Angela's assessment. And still, I think at the moment, Putin is using nuclear threats to deter other European countries from entering into war. But I'm very much concerned about the possible consequences if shelling at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is not being taken care of, because both sides are blaming each other, and that can be used as an excuse to do something on the nuclear front. So that, I think, IAEA should be allowed full access and find out what has really happened.
Russia closed the Zaporizhzhia.
That's the
Zaporizhzhia,
problem. That's the
nuclear
problem.
facilities.
Then still, it'll be there as a possible, how can I put it, as a,
There is issue of nuclear
But
security rather than
so nuclear safety
safety
can
and security.
be turned into nuclear security, and then they may blame it's done by some terrorist or by military forces
Yeah, we're
by
talking
the other
about
side.
another Chernobyl,
And then they may think it is warrants some nuclear response. That, I think, should be managed, urgently. And that, I think, should be demanded to both sides to open the access to IAEA. And again, from our experience, to try to manage chemical weapons use in Syria, still, I think we have to watch carefully whether chemical weapons
No,
or similar
I have
devices.
Before I proceed to the Marco, I have one question related
Maybe
to
10
single question. Yeah, well, you can make
I have
intervention.
one more addition, and that's basically because Won-soo was right in bringing up other weapons of mass destruction, in this case chemical. Russia has explicitly pointed to Ukraine having biological weapons and having weapons labs that basically produce biological weapons. Now, this is, of course, total nonsense. But on the other hand, they're using it possibly as a false flag operation. The Security Council has met 3 times on these accusations that have been made by Russia against Ukraine, saying they're having biological weapons. Because what could happen is they could use that as a pretext to launch a biological weapon, which is also a weapon of mass destruction, totally outlawed by law, including by Russia, who was actually a guarantor of the treaty when it was signed. But on the other hand, that could very well happen because it's a much more limited impact. But it's scary. It's scary, and it isn't limited to, let's say, just a small area. It could be spread in other ways because it could be a virus, or it could be a bacteria, or it could be something that also goes across the borders. That I see as a possibility, however undesirable, and hopefully it won't happen.
But before I proceed to Marco, another question, let me raise one related question. It is really, Ukrainian war is really abnormal, because neither United Nations nor United States are trying to play some kind of mediator role. Has been virtually no commitment actions on the part of the United States and United Nations. Why that is the case? Of course, United Nations, Russia is a member of Permanent Security Council. That could be the reason. But the United States can be more creative or proactive in preventing the war or mediating the war, settling the war. Why so ineffective?
Well, here I am. I've spent 37 years in that organization, and I'm a great believer in what it can do and what it cannot do. But I do think, one always sort of sees the glass as half full rather than as half empty. And I do agree with your question and actually your accusation, if you so want, that the UN has not been as proactive as it could have been. I learned only a couple of days ago that the Secretary General appointed a special envoy for Ukraine. Really? Have you heard anything about that person? I don't even remember his name. It's a he, that I know for sure. But on the other hand, I would have sort of thought that there would have been immediately a mission. There's a mediation. I mean, there are instruments that exist that have been created in the United Nations precisely they have a whole, slew of people who are experts in mediation. So you would have thought that there would have been some people going there. Now, I only see what is visible from the outside. Maybe there were efforts made behind closed doors or at a high level, but outside the public view that I'm not aware of. But I do wish there would have been more than what we've actually seen, because it's been going on for too long. And I do welcome the initiative about the grain, exports and, facilitating that, but it isn't enough. It just isn't enough.
Okay, Wonsu.
I absolutely agree with you that there must be behind the doors mediation, good offices should be going on. And I hope it is going on. Because, I mean, whenever we look back to the crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis, there were roles played by then UN Secretary General and also by the Pope. So many players were involved quietly. So I hope, including the Secretary General and including the leaders in Washington, must do their best to talk to both sides behind the scenes.
No, look, we know that German government worked very hard, and French government worked very hard. Macron visited Moscow, Scholz, did the same things. And we all know Israeli government played a very active role. Okay, we know Erdogan, the Turkish government played a very important role. Even Indonesian president played an important role. But I haven't heard about Guterres visited Ukraine. I know that one, but other than that, I don't see any efforts.
Yeah, but what I'm saying now is those crises was mediated by the invisible mediators. And their role was known afterward. That's the role behind the doors, good offices,
I hope that
mediation
Kim's
to play. I mean, that's the responsibility of UN Secretary General, good offices.
I think the most important role for any political leadership or any leading countries or international organization, their raison d'etre, consist in the preventive diplomacy. Preventing the war is important. Of course, they can play a role in ending the war, but I really do not see any preventive role of this major United Nations or United States, and that's a very pathetic part of the Ukraine crisis. Okay, let me go back to the Marku. Finland used to be a neutral state, okay, and we all love the so-called Finlandization, idea. The Finland has been pursuing very smart and wise foreign policy by remaining a neutral state. But all of a sudden you become a member of NATO. You will soon become a member of NATO. Sweden will soon become the member of NATO. But now go back to Putin's grievance. Okay, his grievance is this: why you invaded? Why did you invade Ukraine? Oh, because there's an enlargement of NATO or eastward of NATO. Okay, now Finland and Sweden joined the NATO. Then NATO has become substantially larger. Okay, and now we have a Baltic 3 states. Okay. And maybe as a result of this war, Ukraine may join it. Maybe Georgia may join it. Okay. Then that being the case, in Europe, you have only NATO versus Russia, Belarus. Okay. And there is no space for OSCE, no multilateral security cooperation regime in Europe. Is it good for European peace or bad?
Well, the Finnish Prime Minister, a lady, 35 years old, I think, was speaking in Brussels.
She danced
the other
very
day.
nicely.
Yeah,
I watched
okay,
the
you have
dancing.
read about her in the papers, perhaps. And she said that we have been naive, Europeans. We have been believing that there's peaceful development in Russia, that Russia is not going to attack any neighboring country, including our country. Let's keep in mind that we have 1,350 kilometers common frontier with Russia. So I think the Finnish president made a speech quite a few days only after Russia had attacked Ukraine and said that now Russia has and Putin has dropped the mask. Now it's the face of death. And it was a long time a very sensitive question in Finland. Should we be members of NATO or no? And then I think it was in May, the Finnish parliament, there are 200 members was voting for membership, Finnish membership in NATO, 132 against 8. So that this is a dramatic change. And then if you allow a few more time, so it was during the wars when Finland was fighting against the Soviet Union, 1939, 1944. So in Sweden there was a slogan, Finland is our concern. Now we turned it around and said in Finland, Sweden is our concern. Now they are following our example, and we were told that when the Swedish Prime Minister learned that Finland is going to apply for, or is planning to apply for membership in NATO, she said, my God, are they doing that? And then they said, okay, we can't help, we must do that too. So that very dramatic change. And if you still allow one personal experience, when I was a young boy, there were Soviet warships in the Helsinki harbor. Now, a couple of months ago, there was a massive U.S. aircraft carrier in the Finnish harbor, and thousands of people were welcoming them. So that dramatic changes. Okay.
Yeah, this will be my final question to the panelists, and I'll open to the floor. And Angela and the Wonsu, really, I'm worried now. NATO is expanding and enlarging, and particularly with the failure of the Minsk Accord 1 and 2, and there's no place for OSCE. And then the NATO is all about collective defense system, common defense, and OSCE has been for collective security system or multilateral security cooperation regime. Therefore, now in Europe, there will be only common defense, but no collective security. And there will be a perpetual tension and conflict with Russia. What do you see the future of European peace? Once first, and then Angela, and then I'll open to the floor.
That's the picture also I see coming. The global polarization between the two camps. One led by US and West, the other led by China and Russia. That is not good, but very hard to avoid, given the tendencies are now multiplying at each other. That said, and I think still we have to reserve the space for maybe not collective security, but for cooperative security, as Helsinki process has been trying to achieve. At least alive, not completely dead. So that we can use that avenue at least to reduce the tensions and manage the risk, and at least keep the crisis from not going out of spiral. So for crisis management and risk reduction. And we need that cooperative security channel, regardless of this growing confrontation between the two camps?
Angela, would it work?
Well,
Would the-
I think it's I think it's a very good approach, and one always hopes that approaches like that are positive and reinforcing basically will work. I have a major problem with the way that NATO has developed, and basically NATO was developed because of the Soviet bloc, because of the whole states in the the Iron Curtain and the other side of the Iron Curtain, and when that all fell apart, what was the rationale for NATO? I mean, the rationale for NATO was what? Against then the Russian Federation? I mean, this just did not ever make any sense. And the difficulty is that, first of all, the European countries had gotten very comfortable being protected by the American power and by the American military posture, that they were not doing a lot to contribute themselves to it, because, first of all, you only had a few women, a few weapons, in some of the countries of the European Union. They didn't really contribute that much financially. They were quite comfortable with that. And the other issue that turned was when there was the war broke out in the now former Yugoslavia. Remember, NATO supported UNPROFOR, and then you had KFOR. You still have KFOR in the former Yugoslavia. This is like, excuse me, I mean, there's a real problem here. And then, and I don't know what is the truth or what is not the truth, but there apparently had been a promise made to the Russian at that time to sort of say NATO will not expand eastward. This is being talked about. Clearly there was nothing in writing. If I believe some of the analysts, it seems to be the case, but none of us will actually know for sure. But it is true that NATO had no natural enemy, quote unquote, even though, that was like then Russia. And I remember that I was under Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs, and Kofi Annan asked me to negotiate an agreement with NATO. And I basically said no. I said I didn't really want to negotiate an agreement with NATO, because I said, what for? And because the NATO is a military alliance. It's not like OSCE, it's not a regional organization that is anchored in the charter, but it's a military alliance. And I said, if we do that with NATO, then we should do it also for the other side. There was the CSTO, or whatever it was called, CSO, and I was basically told by Kofi Annan that you're doing that. So I negotiated that agreement, but very much against my own grain, because I just didn't believe in it. And we still have to think about, now NATO's only, let's say, enemy is Russian Federation. Are we going to extend that and sort of project it past the transatlantic alliance, over to the Asian alliance? No one talks about that.
But I think,
It's
Angela,
uncomfortable.
you raise a very important question. In the whole this concept of alliance is against the United Nations Charter. United Nations Charter is based on collective security system. It's what the community of security, that all countries in the world are members of the United Nations, therefore they constitute the members of security community. You cannot make some countries as a common enemy and common threat. Therefore, either NATO or Warsaw Pact, they are against the United Nations Charter. But now alliances have become the major norms, and all of a sudden collective security and multilateral security cooperation has become some kind of endangered species that is against the United Nations. Therefore, you did a negligence of your duty at the United Nations. Anyhow, I will open to the floor. Maybe Glenn and the Professor Yoon Jung. Okay, Glenn, you first. And then also Professor Song. 여기 앞에 이게 먼저.
Is it on? Yes. Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure where to start, but I mean, I think you're making the wrong assumption. You're asking why the United States has not been engaged in, if you want, peacekeeping operations, and the UN. I mean, I think the reason the UN's not been engaged is fairly self-evident. The Russians are going to veto everything. But I mean, the US has not been engaged. It doesn't want the war to end. I mean, if you're going to do peacekeeping, you're going to want peace, but the US doesn't want peace. And what we're seeing is the United States is ramping up Ukrainian war aims I mean, the original demand was that the Russians go back to their starting point as of February the 24th. And then under pressure from Washington, it was going to be, we need to liberate the whole of Ukraine. Whether that includes Crimea is an open question. And then it became, we need to beat the Russians so comprehensively, they're never capable of doing this again. And it's exactly the same with the Korean War. I mean, this is a civil war in Ukraine. Now, I know which side I'm on, that's a different issue. But, I mean, I was there in 2004 doing election observation, and 85% of the population in Donbass was voting for the pro-Russian candidate, and out where I was up near Chernobyl, 90% were voting for the pro-European candidate. So this is a deeply divided country. I mean, in a sense, I mean, we don't want a winner of this war. So if we have a winner, there's a loser, and that's very, very problematic indeed. And I don't know what the fate of the people of the Donbass will be in terms of Russian language teaching and the rest if there's a clear win there. But so we actually don't want to win. And that's when it starts getting very dangerous, because the logic. Medvedev made the point, we will use nuclear weapons if the future of Russia is under threat. Well, if we're getting to the point that some people in the US want, where Russia is so badly defeated it will be incapable of doing anything like this again, I think there'll be judgments in Moscow that that's a threat to the Russian state. And that's when you've got two options. The soft option is to have an accident in the nuclear power station. And the more brutal option is to actually have, if you want, a tactical nuclear weapon used. Now, so I mean, people need to know what they're playing with. So the idea that you want a complete Ukrainian victory, it seems to me to be a mistake. We need to yes, I want Ukraine to do well. Don't misunderstand me, but I'm not sure that necessarily that point is where some people want to go. And it's very similar, in my view, to MacArthur in the Korean War. Because if he actually stopped at the 38th parallel, you wouldn't have had the Chinese invasion. It would have been a very different experience. And we're in that dangerous territory. I could make some comments on some other points, but I think that maybe that's enough.
Okay, we'll come back.
At the moment.
That's a comment by the Greenfield. Okay, Professor Yoon-jung.
Yes, thank you very much for the interesting discussions. But I'm very worried about, or concerned about the situation in Europe as a foreigner in Europe, because this Europe, what I see now, is not the Europe what I know. I had learned about the history and culture, and especially what we admired for the integration and the whole transformation processes since 1990s. What we see now, actually, I would like to believe you when you say there should be someone in the background to negotiate about this problem now. But I don't see anyone. If you see that the young German lady, the foreign minister, she argued in the public. She told one time in German, es ist egal, was die Wähler denken. That is not my problem what the voters think. She wants to become the moralist as such. So she's doing as the top moralist in Europe, and there is no one I see, no politicians or other people who are thinking or who are thinking about this problem from the end, how to end the conflict or how to end the war. There is actually no idea about that or no discussion in the public. I don't know whether it's their background to such a discussion or not, but in the 1960s, in the Cuba Missile Crisis or during the time of the Berlin Wall, the construction of Berlin, direct after the Berlin Wall, there was such a process. So I would like to believe that is such a crisis, but I can't imagine now. No? There is one question: who would be the person in U.S.? We can't find that, but even in Europe there is no one. And what we see is that deep division in European society between the generations. Now we are the same, or more or less same generation, so that's the reason that we are talking about to make a moderate resolution or solution for the problem. But when I talk with my staffs at my institute or the young generation, there's so strong moralistic approach to the problem. Putin should be disappeared, destroyed, Russia. So that's their position. This normal talk, what I hear every day in the discussion in our institute. So about this situation, I'm very worried about that. And then the other problem is very open racist approach. Actually, when the Ukraine refugees came to Germany or Europe, they found everything. Actually, they got huge support from the humanitarian aspect. Is very important. But if you compare with the Syrian refugees, for 3 years ago, there are huge discussion. They didn't, still now, they have no comfort, houses or job opportunity, but immediately the Ukrainians came. They have jobs, and they get plots, and everything. So how can you tell that? No, this is, there are refugees, such refugees there. So I'm now learning about European society, totally different now.
Okay, thank you. Now, Professor Song Nam-sun. 마이크 갖다 드리죠.
Okay, let me ask a question about the impact of Ukraine war on Korea or Korean Peninsula and East Asia. There seems to be a fact, although I don't like it. The Ukraine war, Russian invasion of Ukraine, put an end to non-alignment history in Europe. There's no question about that. There's no room anymore in which you can work and live free from military alignment. My question is, will it be the case in Korea in future? Or what will happen in East Asia? You know, yes, North Korea is militarily tied to China, while South Korea is militarily associated to the US. We know that. But both of them historically tried and wanted to be from them. For instance, North Korea once was, they tried to be the leader of non-alignment movement in the 60s and 70s. And even Kim Jong-un struggled to be free from China after he took the power for a couple of years. Then he gave up, right? And in South Korea, well, particularly the liberal political forces tried to be relatively free from the military alignment with the US. That's the history, yes? But if we suppose the situation that Japan, South Korea, America, trilateral alignment getting consolidated, while China, Russia, North Korean alignment getting consolidated, then what will happen? You know, the six-party talks you mentioned, it is now, Mark, what did you say? It is not awake. It is in sleep. But even if we could awake this framework, then if the situation I mentioned gets real, the sixth party talks end up with just bilateral confrontation and bilateral talk. I don't imagine this become to a real situation, but do you think that will be the case in future? I'd like to ask Professor Kim and Mark.
Okay, we have two, we had two comments and one question. Okay, I will take some more. Okay, over there. Who raised hand? Okay. Would you identify yourself? Why don't you take off your mask,
Okay. My name is Doan Lee, and I'm a graduate student studying to become an interpreter. I will thank you for sharing brilliant insights about the agenda. So my question is, with the prolonged Russian invasion of Ukraine compounding already pandemic-battered global economy, it is our solemn duty to speak up for Ukraine to help them regain their territorial integrity and to accelerate the pace of ceasefire. But since we are highly dependent on China and Russia in terms of economy and energy, as aforementioned, we're in a difficult position to engage in dialogues. However, as the war drags on, the prolonged war will not only exacerbate our economy, but also give misleading messages to North Korea in terms of complete denuclearization, since the war broke out in the wake of Ukraine's abandonment of nuclear weapon. I would like to know what our strategic interest is in this part. Should we remain as an observer and wait until the end of the war, or should we show more aggressive measures like staging more military drills and exercises by strengthening our US alliance? Because I believe that strengthening our nuclear capabilities will enhance our security within the Korean Peninsula, but it would also escalate tensions, leaving little chance for North Korea to declare complete denuclearization. So I'm curious, what approach should we take to open a dialogue with North Korea in a more peaceful manner? And I believe the same goes with the relationship between UN and Russia. So I would like to know what your thoughts are about the agenda.
Oh, too many questions. Anyhow, we'll start with Wonsu and Marco, and then Angela, you can make a final comment and answer. And if we have some more time, I will take more questions from floor.
Yes. First, on the question on six-party process, I absolutely agree with your view that unless, whether it is sleeping, dormant, or dead, to reawaken that process requires different thinking of the parties. So unless the parties change their thinking, not much use to resurrect the process, because process follows the substance in thinking. But once parties somehow find common ground on the substance of rationale, which they think now time to talk again comes, then we can resurrect the process so that that process will remain there regardless of future differences to emerge. Because we always learn the lesson from our UN experiences that it is easier to manage problems with some process. Without process, even we cannot find where we begin to talk. And we spent more than 2 years to talk about four-party talks in the past. And it didn't live long. And then we designed the six-party process. Now it is being dormant for a long time, but still I don't see any other way to come out with a comprehensive plan for a peaceful and nuclear-free Korean Peninsula without involving these six parties. So whatever formula we come up with, we have to make them persuaded. So that's, although I very much agree with you that no matter how much effort we are putting into a revival process, without the change in substance, not much use. So we have to change the thinking first. Your comment. I don't disagree with what you said. At the moment, as we all said, not much real prospect for any ending of the conflict is in sight. That's why no effort for mediation can bear fruit. Because also from our experiences at UN, dealing with so many conflicts, the space, diplomatic space for ending the conflict opens up only when the parties give up military solution. But that point is not there yet. But that doesn't mean we have to give up our efforts for mediation, because we have to prepare the grounds. And what I said was, it is the collective responsibility of the UN, of the US, of Europe, of Finland, I mean, whoever is in charge, even the Pope, I hope. So that mediation effort should not be given up, because we don't see the prospect of ending the conflict. But who knows? I think some point will come, parties will realize military solution will not work any longer. And then they need someone to save their face, to lean on, and ask to talk to the other side. So I don't disagree with your observation at all. But what we are saying was, we have to get prepared our mediation efforts now. Otherwise, I'm afraid it may be too late. So that's why I very much like the idea, Secretary General visiting there, despite humiliation he received, but also appointing special envoy. I hope US and other countries will do the same thing for the future ending of the conflict.
Okay, Marco.
Thank you very much. One thing, I think a lot of important processes have been on so-called track 2 or track 1.5 level, and I have been active observer, as they call it, of a project which has been led by Atlanta University and Professor John Endicott. And the project has been called and is called a Limited Nuclear Weapons Free Zone for Northeast Asia. I think the concrete results are quite modest at the moment, but it has opened a forum for, let's say, free discussion, and even North Koreans have now and then been involved, sometimes participating in the meetings, or then I have even had a role to convey to them messages from the process. So I think this is one forum which should be used. And then I think, for instance, the six-party talks as an outsider, I think that was really something like in the CSC process. So it was not only that people met at the conference room, but they had, let's say, excursions somewhere outside or even some sports events and so on. And they learned to understand each other as representing various cultures. And I think a very disappointing experience is that when Donald Trump tried to have a shortcut immediate result of the most dangerous conflict with Kim Jong-il in Singapore. So you can't solve such a fundamental crisis by sitting 2 days in Singapore at a table. And I think then you should also use this. We have a number of experts in various fields in civil society who should be utilized. And I think this Sendicott's project is a good example. And there's a number of South Koreans participating. You must know them, many of them. And these should be used. I think what we started in Helsinki in 1972, quite exactly 50 years ago, that was just to open a forum where all participating states can unofficially, more or less unofficially, talk about, not being committed to any result. So this is my, let's say, idea how to proceed in this part of the world.
I wanted to come back about the younger generation that you spoke about, because it's extremely important. And remember, I also referenced that in my address. And when you look at there was an opinion poll that was taken about 3 years ago. And, opinion polls are taken all the time. But this was like thousands of people, millennials basically, and all over Europe. And what the outcome was, which was quite astounding, is that the millennials believe that nuclear war should never happen, but not only should never happen, that nuclear weapons shouldn't exist, and that they would basically be in favor of giving up nuclear weapons in their own, or let's say not in their own countries, because obviously, in European countries, it's only France and the UK who have weapons, but on the other ones, they are stationing nuclear weapons in Germany and Netherlands, etc. So this was a really very important finding, and it would be interesting to see if there was an opinion poll taken now, what would be the outcome of it? What worries me about the current situation is that you have a splitting of opinions, and basically it's like it has to be cohesive, and the cohesiveness is, or the glue that holds Europe together right now is NATO. I don't like that. NATO is a military alliance. I mean, I'd like to move away from that. And I'm very sorry, Markku, but I'm very sorry that Sweden and Finland gave up their neutrality and made an application to join NATO. Because basically that you have countries, you had Sweden, Finland, you have Ireland still, you have Austria, you have Switzerland, I mean Switzerland not being European still, but not EU, that you have Malta. So basically the variety that you have that provide a different viewpoint of what's happening is gone. And Switzerland, I was in Switzerland about 2.5 months ago, and I spoke to someone there who was a long-time official in the foreign ministry, and they're actually looking at the issue of neutrality now. And believe it or not, this is coming up officially in the Swiss government, that they're saying, well, maybe we should reconsider our neutrality. I find that a very deplorable situation. I don't like it at all. I would like to have different views, different opinions, and not to have this monolith of a military alliance that basically is dominating whatever happens in Europe. Because you don't feel it in the United States. I mean, that's all one way, and that's over to Europe. And that, to my mind, is a loss in diversity that I very much regret. But on the other hand, it's a fact of life, and it's also a fact of life, and we've talked about that earlier, that the governments in Europe are becoming very much right-oriented in terms of less, maybe I shouldn't say democratic, but basically more rightist, and that again I see as very much as a threat. And as a final, and I want to make a pivot to another subject very quickly, what could happen is that Ukraine could end up as a frozen conflict. Not the whole country, but think about right now the problem between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Nagorno-Karabakh, frozen conflict. Think about Georgia, Abkhazia, frozen conflict. Think about a couple of these other conflicts that do exist in Europe, but that haven't been solved, that haven't been addressed, that have been basically left aside to linger for this. And then I'm also thinking that if there is a portion of the Ukraine that then becomes, quote unquote, a frozen conflict, could that be considered a win for both sides? Because it's not like Ukraine has given up territory, it's not like Russia has gained territory, though, however, the way that you can define it, I find that a very dangerous consideration.
It was very, very productive discussion, and we can draw several, lessons from the current debate as well as war in Ukraine. The first one is what? There's no such thing as a winner in the war. War involves negative-sum game, lose and lose. It's neither so-called zero-sum, winner and loser, but it's a lose and lose. Therefore, we should keep that in mind. Therefore, it is very, very important for us to come up with prevention of war rather than winning the war. Second lesson is there is a real danger for escalation of conventional conflict into nuclear conflict. And North Korea has nuclear weapons and claims it has a full-fledged nuclear weapons. Therefore, we cannot allow the possibility of escalation of a conventional conflict into the nuclear conflict. That we should make every effort to prevent that kinds of escalation on the Korean Peninsula. And third one, as Glenn and Angela pointed out, one of the primary causes of Ukrainian war is internal division. Okay, and Euromaidan, the pro-Europe Ukrainian population, and pro-Russian population, 70 to 30. Okay, that internal cleavages paved way to the Ukrainian war. I think we can learn from the lesson. Okay, South Korea is ethnically homogeneous. Okay, however, so-called ideological and policy polarization is very deep and wide and protracted. Therefore, how political leaders can come up with, that kinds of cleavages and polarization and come up with some kinds of national consensus, as Ambassador Kim Won-soo pointed out. And that will be the third lesson. And fourth lesson is obviously in the importance of diplomacy and also importance of some kinds of multilateral approach. And Won-soo and also Professor Song raised, and also Marco talked about the six-party talk. Six-party talk is a really, really good institutional mechanism to address security issues. But I would propose that we should elevate the six-party talk to the summit level. Then we put the title called Northeast Asian Security Summit. That inviting American president, Japanese prime minister, Chinese president, Russian president, and North Korean leader, and South Korean president. If leaders sit together and talk together, okay, then we might be able to come up with a new solution. But again, then that goes back to the point Angela raised. Military alliances versus so-called regional collective security. And unfortunately, the American position on the security, collective security, idea is rather negative and, hesitant. Okay, but please keep in mind, the United Nations Charter is based on collective security system, not collective defense system such as a military alliance. But I think that we should go through the quite intense struggle in shaping new paradigm on common security and collective security system through the multilateral security cooperation. I think that those are the very important lessons we gain, and therefore, and I think that we have some food for thought and some agenda for next year's Korea-Europe Peace Forum. I thank you. I again thank you for your excellent presentation, and also I thank you your very active participation from Flow. I will adjourn this session. Thank you.
This concludes day 1 of the Korea-Europe Peace Forum. Tomorrow's first session will begin at 10 a.m. in this room. We'll see you then. Thank you.